Make Peace with Nature is a syndicated public affairs presentation of this station dealing with solutions to problems of energy, conservation, and the environment. Today's program will be hosted by David Serber.
Hello, and welcome to Make Peace with Nature. I should like to begin by quoting from a selection of articles which have appeared recently in the Washington Post and the Guardian newspaper and on NPR and CNN. Quote, "The Trump administration recently announced significant cuts to funding earmarked for the environment, including budget cuts for climate change research and mitigation. According to the World Health Organization, between 2030 and 2050, climate change will cause 250,000 deaths per year from heat stress. Deadly heat waves, changes in precipitation patterns, and natural disasters resulting from global warming will affect access to clean air, safe drinking water, nutritious foods, and will compromise our very safety and security. These concerns are sufficiently foreseeable such that the U.S. Department of Defense has declared climate change a worldwide destabilizing force. My studio guest believes that certain actions by executive order of Mr. Trump have substantially degraded the ability and inclination of various responsible agencies of the federal government to intervene to enforce plans to identify and control the risks and threats posed by climate change. David Altman has practiced the specialty of environmental law since 1974 from his office in downtown Cincinnati. He has a reputation for securing positive outcomes for clients which have in the aggregate made us all safer and made him a familiar and respected figure in the national legal community and a familiar face in local, state, and federal courts. More after this.
The views expressed on Make Peace with Nature are those of the participants and not necessarily those of this station or the program's underwriters.
Here to have back from last week David Altman, a longtime friend, been on the show off and on for many years, and so he is here to discuss what he knows best. His concern about the rules and regulations of the EPA, which have been shredded, my words, as a result of the man that Mr. Trump appointed to administer the EPA, who apparently was an attorney or an attorney general in Arkansas, I believe. Oklahoma. Did he not, whilst he was attorney general, file 15 or 16 lawsuits against the very agency he now runs?
Yeah, well, that's true. And I think it's the spirit. I mean, there's certainly a lot of reasons to file lawsuits against federal agencies, but it's the thread and theme behind those lawsuits, which is stopping the EPA from doing it, enforcing its mandate to protect health and the environment. That's the problem. Right. It's not just they file lawsuits.
Could the budget cuts alone, 35%, I believe, in other words, thousands of employees are being laid off. That's enough of a fly in the ointment, isn't it, to slow the agency down no matter who runs it?
The agency needed more resources to protect people and the environment. With fewer resources, that would be enough, but it's sort of like having somebody shot after they were blown up in a car. That's why I say this administration isn't just satisfied with hindering environmental enforcement. They want to do everything they can to be sure it doesn't happen. It's misguided. It's a lesson we learned in the 60s and 70s, and it is the job blackmail, which is really what it used to be called when it was used in the earliest days of the environment, trying to say there's a choice between jobs and the environment. It makes absolutely no sense today. It didn't make any sense back then, and that was established over and over again, but we're right back to the same thing. Under the guise of putting coal miners back to work, which sadly for the coal miners isn't going to happen.
No, it's an erroneous statement.
Yeah.
They're out of work not because of the fact that they're not digging coal, but the fact that this, is it not true that the power plants have switched to a cheaper fuel, as in natural gas?
Exactly, and that's the problem. That's where the jobs have gone. This isn't allowing pollution in streams, allowing all kinds of other incremental changes by removing the preventative regulations, which is part of the base, cutting the funding, and then on top of that, having the EPA administrator, which doesn't like what he calls regulation, he's in charge of enforcement. He's the one that's going to decide what gets enforced. I mean, he and the executive orders that come down from the
So
president.
under the law, he can just send a signal down to his people saying, we're not, it's discretionary. He has the power to tell the employees, don't worry about this, don't worry about that, even though there's a law on the books
And he
directing them otherwise.
Unless it's a mandatory requirement to do something, mandatory, his discretion, like that of a prosecutor, is extraordinarily difficult to challenge. But we don't want to get too hung up in the issues of administrative law and the nuances of the law. The bottom line is that where we should be, for example, adding compounds to lists of regulations, we're going to be deregulating compounds that are already included. So let's take, as we started to do at the end of the last show we did, which was on last week, safe drinking water. People don't realize that we have a handful of chemicals, of the 85,000 chemicals that are out there in the environment, or probably a lot more, but let's just use that figure. You have only a handful of chemicals that are regulated under the Safe Drinking Water Act. And then so things like the Teflon derivative PFOA, or C8 as it's called, which is the stuff that we just had a major lawsuit settled in Ohio for people in the Ohio Valley who were in West Virginia and Ohio who had cancers specifically related, generally related to their exposure to PFOA. That's what the lawsuits were all about in court.
Did you handle that?
No. I handled a case involving a water company, but a local attorney spearheaded that. Cincinnati attorney named Rob Ballot, New York Times, has written about this case. In any event, I don't want to get too hung up in that, but that is not a regulated chemical, even though once it's out in the environment, it lasts more than 2,000 years in the environment.
And you believe if it is in the drink, first of all, do you believe for yourself that it is in your drinking water?
Well, we know
Our
it's
drinking
in
water.
it's in my client's drinking water, but my client has a granular activated carbon system that is installed to remove it from the drinking water.
At his water tap?
At the rural water company that I represented, but there and then there are 5 others that have that. But all down the Ohio River, there are if this stuff flows with the river, how many other water companies? We know it's in the Ohio River. Now the question is always, well, yeah, it lasts 2,000 years in the environment. It isn't going to go away, but you don't need to worry because you're only taking small amounts of this chemical in. Well, there's a whole story about that, and now that chemical is still unregulated. It's still unregulated, and there are tens of thousands of other chemicals. Not all of them persist 2,000 years in the environment, but those are not on the list. So when you meet all federal standards for your drinking water, you have to ask yourself, what is my water company testing for? They have to test for those. And then, do we have water treatment? And what are these other chemicals? Do we have a right to even know, so we know what choices to make?
Well, but is it actually possible to test the drinking water of the people watching this show? can they call someone and test the water, B, find out what's in the water, and then C, figure out a way to at least make their personal faucet put out non-cancerous water?
Well, the best thing to do is centralized water treatment, such as we have in Cincinnati with granular activated carbon, so that many of these chemicals that are in the water will be taken out simply because you use a battery of controls. Those are expensive. Those are the kind of infrastructure we should be building. But as you and I know, from years of working in this area, and I was on the Citizen Scientist Drinking Water Committee that got the world-class, quote-unquote, GAC system we have here, granular activated carbon system we have here in Cincinnati, that even that technology, as good as it is, it only removes certain chemicals very well, another set of chemicals pretty well, but another set of chemicals not well at all. So, it's just a question of what do these labels mean? And yes, let's get the technology installed, and yes, that's an infrastructure upgrade we need to do. But while we're deregulating chemicals, we're not even considering whether they ought to be included in the list. And once they're included in the list, we will develop technologies to make sure they're removed. But this can take decades.
Right. So are you saying that you separated into 3 levels of removal of certain chemicals, activated carbon filtration system? Couldn't they just put more filters down the line?
Well,
no.
Simple? I mean, the thing about, you have to know the chemical nature of the compound. So for example, something called C8, which is what I just talked, PFOA or this Teflon related stuff, that will get caught. It will be removed pretty well by granular activated carbon.
At the water treatment plant.
At the treatment plant. And that's, the trend is to get all these people hooked up to the water treatment plant. That will be removed. But C4, which is always around when you have C8, that probably will go right through the carbon. However, the worst stuff, the C11 and C12, if it's there, the longer chain carbon, they will get caught up.
And probably. Are they presently in the drinking water of the people watching this program?
Well, some people, yes. And some people around the Ohio River, more likely, and many other
places. And these are they all tagged as cancer causing?
Well, they are definitely tagged by science and by a group of scientists who did special work on this one chemical, C8. But the C11, C12, C7, C6, the other related compounds haven't even been tested.
Right, but what's producing these things and how are they getting in the river? I don't think these numbers may not mean much to the people watching, but what company is polluting the Ohio River with these various seeds that you have mentioned?
Putting whether it's polluting or not is a question of whether they violated any laws. That's a more complicated issue. I'm taking it to the common sense. Whether it's pollution is a question of whether it is a contamination of the river. And the question is, how badly is it contaminated? And I'm just using one chemical. There are thousands of chemicals. So the idea that deregulating chemicals that aren't even regulated yet, going back in the other direction, is the wrong way to move. That's the key point that I'm making.
I understand.
Yeah, and so we're having a very sophisticated, with one chemical and its derivative chemicals, a very sophisticated discussion, but that's just one chemical. Deregulation takes all that off the board.
And it's all off the board, again, before we take the break, because of the actions of Mr. Trump?
It's all off the board based on what he intends to do and what his...
what he has done so far and what he has yet to do?
Exactly.
All right. Folks, we'll be right back.
The views expressed on Make Peace with Nature are those of the participants and not necessarily those of this station or the program's underwriters.
The news is not pleasant. Every show can't be something to celebrate with a couple of drinks after the program, if you will, or however you choose to celebrate anything. It's what you're saying here the last 2 weeks is not good news.
Well, that's what every responsible journalist or people that are watching, and probably even responsible members of industry, because you got to remember, many industries, industry has not always fought these things. In the early days, of course, industry did. But we've gotten a lot of the environmental help because of courageous environmental groups that tend to be heavily underfunded, and industry that realizes that it employs people that have to drink the water, breathe the air, and that fair and reasonable and firm regulation is a good thing. This is a radical idea, and it has been
wait a
open.
minute. If that's the case, and I think I understand what you're saying, if people, major corporations, the Fortune 500 companies here in the city, believe it's in their interest to have their employees who live in here, and there are a number of Fortune 500 companies within the range of this station and not the scope of this program, if they realize that they want a clean environment for their employees, safe drinking water, the air to breathe, as you know, 30% of the school children in Hamilton County, 30% for God's sake, have asthma. So if they realize this, then forget about the EPA and what he's done to disassemble it, if you will, the house of cards expression you used last time. Won't they just go ahead and try on their own initiative? They don't have to answer to the EPA if they go beyond what would have been the regulations and clean up on their own initiative.
Well, there's something else we learned, and that is called the race to the bottom. When you're in the race, when all your competitors can cut their spending to do things to clean up, or when you can dump things and get away with it, when there's no, and all businesses use an analysis, a risk analysis, and litigation and the threat of litigation is a deterrent. When you remove that deterrent, you're going to create behavior. Yeah, there might be a handful of companies that say, I'm going to tell my stockholders that they're going to pay for this. But most are going to be economic animals. They're going to say, we're going to do what I have a duty to do, which is to protect my investment of my stockholders. And sure, it would be nice in a wonderful world.
So the bottom line comes before bad air.
For
air.
Economic reasoning, it always has and it always will. That is why people who are good people but misguided fought regulation, like the Ford Motor Company in the early days fought the Clean Air Act. One of the vice presidents years ago said to me, Dave, I'm like the drunk that appears in church for the first time, wait till you see me here a few Sundays. He said, we're behind now, the Clean Air Act. Yeah, we fought it tooth and nail, we did everything we could to stop it, but we see the merit of it.
All right. Here's a question I haven't asked you in the last 2 weeks. Even though this man, is your firm belief, and you're qualified to make this observation, has withdrawn a sufficient number of cards that the agency, for all practical purposes, will be neuterized, if you will, emasculated. Mm-hmm. Right. Aren't there state EPAs that he can't have any effect on, and can't they come to the rescue?
Well, boy, I'm glad you said that. That's widely varied. So, for example, yes, if you have a good, let's say Minnesota happens to have a good state agency, they will do their best to protect, but there'll be tremendous pressure because the federal system will be not there to take the competitors of companies that are in Minnesota, and those companies being outside, the competitors being outside Minnesota, they don't have to have the cost to comply because the Fed isn't driving. Other agencies, like Ohio's, the federal government has been the reason Ohio has not gone specifically crazy, and they've done a lot of things to try to make regulation go away in Ohio over the years. And by the way, under bipartisan group of governors, not just Republican governors, but because of the cooperative collaborative nature of the federal-state relationship, the feds have stopped Ohio from doing certain very bad things that will weaken the environmental enforcement. And if you take the feds away, why wouldn't Ohio not do what it wants to do?
But the truth is, Ohio,
for example, I'm picking
for
Ohio.
example,
Yeah.
but is there not a division of the EPA, not of the federal EPA, but every state has its own EPA, whatever they call it. And certain cities, for example, the city of Cincinnati has an environmental quality agency. You yourself helped write the legislation for that.
Well, the city's environmental quality agency doesn't have anything to do with the things we're talking about.
It doesn't?
No, it mainly is doing a lot with energy, and it's not a regulatory agency. It doesn't do any enforcement.
All right, then.
So let's leave that out.
Okay, fine. There are 50 states. Do all 50 states have a executive, a cabinet level EPA?
Yes.
That's what you're saying.
And let me explain to you that another lesson we learned in the 60s and 70s. Pollution crosses state lines.
No, obviously.
It's interstate. Whenever you have a problem that's interstate in nature, for example, interstate commerce, if it's a health-related issue, interstate commerce is money in commerce. So we regulate it nationally. Pollution, it crosses state lines. We have always regulated it federally. States can have wonderful ideas about enforcement, but they don't necessarily deal with what's happening. For example, there's a company in West Virginia that is pretty well established to be the cause of that Teflon-related material called C8, PFOA, perfluorinated octanic acid, in the drinking waters in Ohio and in West Virginia. Well, that crosses state lines. Ohio can't very easily regulate West Virginia. I'm not saying the U.S. EPA's done a smashing job of it, but at least they've asked for a lot of the right things, even though it wasn't, and they didn't choose to enforce some of the things they asked for. So when you take away, though, the hammer of the federal government, the state agencies don't work either, but that doesn't stop a very good state agency from regulate to protect health and the environment, and that'll tend to be the absolute worst cases. But the preventative,
it will be too little. It'll be too weak, because the signal coming from Washington is the hell with it. All bets are off. Just let things.
We want
go
coal
back.
miners to go back to work. Yeah. Therefore, we're going to.
Even though there are no mining jobs. Right?
Yeah.
You did say last week that certain major groups, such as the NRDC, National Resources Defense Council, they have brought a suit to try to prevent these executive orders from taking effect?
There are a flood of issues, and incrementally, the ones that look most winnable, the national environmental groups, Earth Justice and NRDC, Sierra Club, many others, will file specific lawsuits seeking to undo some of the damage. Those suits will go on for a long time. But when you're fighting, I don't want anybody to get, that's important. But when you're fighting an administration that is trying to repeal, without telling you, just telling you that they're going to gut the regs, they are in effect repealing the federal environmental laws. And
De facto.
And people need to understand that.
What can people watching do?
Well, one lame thing is that, for the moment, people can enforce the law.
I'm not talking about the people watching this program.
Well,
what can they do?
Well, they need to know first that in the short term, as a stopgap measure, they can use citizen suit provisions in all of the federal environmental laws to try to enforce the laws. If the regulations are gutted, that complicates that, but there are ways it can do that. But then basically, especially people in rural areas, the kind of people I generally represent, who are suffering from pollution, who probably voted for Donald Trump because of demographic pattern of where they live. And they value their land in Kentucky, their land in southern Ohio, their grandchildren, which of course they do, their children, all these things. They need to send a message that we understand what's going on. We've heard about what's going on. We've pieced it together, and they need to start reading getting the paper, reading some paper like the Times or the Washington Post, New York Times or Washington Post.
What you're saying, and we just have 30 seconds, is that for now, people watching the program who may live near the sources of pollution, a factory or some treatment plant that's out of whack and is not being regulated, they are able to bring a lawsuit. Aren't there huge fees? Again, you only have about 30 seconds to
Sure,
answer.
there are
huge
very well
fees to file this?
There very well can be, and that's why I expect to see a rollback of FOIA, because the one thing that counterbalances the huge fees is today, the open records about the pollution, the facts about pollution are there in the government, and they can allow a notice letter to be sent out to get these problems corrected.
You're talking about the Freedom of Information Act?
The Freedom of Information Act and state counterparts. But as you start to dry up that area, you've really made democracy not work, and you've made the laws not
Dave,
work.
there's never enough time, so maybe in a month or so you'll come back and perhaps there'll be some breakthrough that we can encourage. But anyway, it's not pleasant, but it's the truth. And somebody once said, the truth is much like the rain. You can never tell just who's going to get wet. Folks, it's been interesting to say the least. Thank you all for taking the time to watch, and please take the time next week.